Hello everyone, we're going to talk about cerebral cortex. Topography. The complicated folding of the surface of the cerebral hemispheres substantially increases the surface area and therefore the volume of the cerebral cortex. The folds or convolutions are called gyri and the intervening grooves are called sulci. About two-thirds of the cortex forms the walls of the sulci and is therefore hidden from surface view. Whereas a sulcus is a groove that indents the surface of the cerebral hemisphere, a fissure is a cleft that separates different components of the brain. Despite the different definitions of sulci and fissures, the two terms are frequently used interchangeably for the deepest sulci.
Hi, in this video I'm going to talk about the gross cortical anatomy of the brain. So we're going to be looking at the brain from its lateral aspect. So I'll just draw it up here. There are two ways of looking at the brain. One is its gross anatomy, which is just the anatomy as we see it. And the other is looking at it functionally, so splitting up the brain into its functional parts. Here we're going to look at just the gross anatomy, and in the next video we'll look at the functional anatomy and how it relates. So here we have the central sulcus. And this is a very important sulcus in the brain. In front of it we have the precentral gyrus, at this point I should say that the sulcus or the sulci are the valleys, the raised parts or the hills we call the gyri or gyrus singular. So here we have the postcentral gyrus. Here is the superior frontal gyrus. Below that is the middle frontal gyrus. And down here is the inferior frontal gyrus. Now this big line here separates the temporal lobe from the rest of the brain, and we call this the lateral sulcus, also known as the Sylvian fissure. Here is the superior temporal gyrus. Below it is the middle temporal gyrus. And below that is the inferior temporal gyrus. So the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe are quite easy. Up here we have the superior parietal lobule, and below it we have the inferior parietal lobule. Down here we have the pars orbitalis, and here is called the pars triangularis, and here is the pars opercularis. These are named pars orbitalis because it's the part above the orbit, the pars triangularis, which is the triangular part, and the pars opercularis, which means a lid. And it's called the lid because underneath it is the insular cortex. Now over here is a supramarginal gyrus, and then around here is the angular gyrus. Now let's name some sulci. Here is the parieto-occipital fissure, and this separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. And this is the occipital notch. It does the same, but inferiorly. Here is the transoccipital sulcus, and here is the lateral occipital sulcus. Here is the pre-central sulcus, and behind the central sulcus is the post-central sulcus. Now, in the front, we have the superior frontal sulcus and the inferior frontal sulcus, and these separate the three gyri of the frontal lobe. Down here is the superior temporal sulcus and the middle temporal sulcus. There's also an inferior temporal sulcus, but that can be seen from the other side of the brain. We'll have a look at that in a later video. And that's an overview of the gross cortical anatomy of the brain.
Sulci and fissures. The lateral and parieto-occipital sulci appear early in fetal development and are especially deep in the mature brain. These, together with the central and circular sulci, are the boundaries for division of the cerebral hemisphere into the frontal, parietal, insular, temporal, and occipital lobes.
Hi, in this video, I'm going to be talking about functional cortical anatomy. We're going to be having a look at the brain from the lateral surface. So first of all, I'll draw up the brain. So I'm going to use Brodmann areas to describe the functional anatomy of the brain. Now, Brodmann was a neuroanatomist, and he split the brain up into various functional parts. And he gave each part a number. And we still sometimes use these numbers to refer to certain parts of the brain today. So I'll number the Brodmann areas, and I'll also give their function. Now, I won't give all the Brodmann areas, but I'll give the ones that I think are important to know. So first of all, I'll label Brodmann areas 1, 2, and 3. And this is in the post-central gyrus. And this is the primary somatosensory cortex. So this is where the inputs of all your touch from your body come into the brain. They're labelled in this order, 3, 1, 2, by convention. Brodmann area 4, in the precentral gyrus, is the primary motor cortex. So this is a primary control centre for movements of the body. Brodmann areas 5 and 7 in the superior parietal lobule make up the somatosensory association cortex. Now, Brodmann area 8 is in the superior frontal gyrus, and it controls the frontal eye fields, which basically allow smooth movement of the eyes. Now, Brodmann areas 9 and 46, which are part of the superior frontal gyrus and the middle frontal gyrus, make up the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and this is involved in motor planning. Now, Brodmann area 10 at the front is the anterior prefrontal cortex, and this is involved in a higher cognition. Up the back here, we have Brodmann areas 17, 18, and 19. And these are in the occipital lobe. 17 is the primary visual cortex. So this is where we get input from the eyes. We often call this V1. Then 18 and 19 are V2 and V3 respectively. They're more association cortices for the visual system. Now over here, 41 and 42 and 22 lie in the temporal lobe, in the superior temporal gyrus. 41 and 42 are the primary and association auditory complex. And Wernicke's area, which is Brodmann number 22, is a very important part of the brain for understanding language. Now up here we have 40 and 39. 40 is important in language perception, and that's part of the supramarginal gyrus. 39 is important for language, maths, and cognition, and that's part of the angular gyrus. Now down here in the pars triangularis is Broca's area, and this is another area we hear a lot about, and it's involved in the formation of language. And that's an overview of the functional cortical anatomy from the lateral surface. In the next video, we'll have a look at the gross cortical anatomy of the medial surface of the hemisphere. For more free tutorials and the PDF for this tutorial,
The lateral sulcus, fissure of Sylvius or Sylvian fissure, begins as a deep furrow on the inferior surface of the hemisphere. This is the stem of the sulcus, which extends laterally between the frontal and temporal lobes and divides into 3 rami when reaching the lateral surface. Whereas the posterior ramus is the main part of the sulcus on the lateral surface of the hemisphere, the anterior and ascending rami project from only a short distance into the frontal lobe. An area of the cortex called the insular lobe or insula, island of rail, lies at the bottom of the lateral sulcus and is hidden from surface view. This cortex appears to have been bound to the underlying corpus striatum during late embryonic and lateral fetal development. Growth of the surrounding cortex will then produce the deep lateral sulcus. The central sulcus, sulcus of Rolando, Rolandic sulcus, is an important landmark for the sensorimotor cortex because of the first somatic sensory area is immediately behind the sulcus, and the primary motor area is immediately in front of it. The central sulcus intends to superior border of the hemisphere about 1 cm behind the midpoint between the frontal and occipital poles. The sulcus slopes downward and forward, stopping just short of the lateral sulcus, and there are usually 2 bends along its course. The central sulcus is about 2 cm deep. Its walls therefore constitute much of the sensorimotor cortex.
Hi, in this video I'm going to talk about the gross cortical anatomy of the medial surface of a hemisphere of the brain. So this is looking at half a brain when you cut straight through the center of it long ways. So I'll just draw the brain up here. So I'll start by labeling the third ventricle. That's this space in the middle, and it would be filled with cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF. Then this big area up here is a big bit of white matter called the corpus callosum, and it's the main white matter tract that connects the two hemispheres of the brain together. Now just under here we have the septum, or the septum pellucidum, which runs between both of the lateral ventricles, and below that we have the fornix. The fornix is another white matter tract. Now just above the corpus callosum we have the cingulate gyrus. Above and anteriorly we have the superior frontal gyrus. I'll just add in a very important feature. Here we have the paracentral lobule. Behind that we have the cuneus and the precuneus. Then down here is the lingual gyrus. The uncus is this little bit that sticks up here. The hippocampal gyrus lies below that. The fusiform gyrus is this long gyrus below that. And then the inferior temporal gyrus lies below that. And we saw the middle and superior temporal gyri and the inferior temporal gyrus on the lateral surface of the brain. Now round the front here is a par-olfactory area. Now I said this was an important feature. This is a central sulcus. Here we have the cingulate sulcus. Here is the parieto-occipital fissure. And we saw that on the lateral aspect of the brain. Here we have the calcarine fissure. And down here is the collateral sulcus. And here is the inferior temporal sulcus, which in an earlier video I mentioned we'd see. And that's an overview of the gross cortical anatomy of the medial aspect of the hemisphere. In the next video, we're going to look at the functional anatomy of this same surface of the hemisphere. For more free tutorials and the
Lobes of the cerebral hemisphere. The frontal lobe occupies the entire area in front of the central sulcus and above the lateral sulcus of the lateral surface. The medial surface of the frontal lobe envelopes the anterior part of the corpus callosum and is bounded posteriorly by a line drawn between the central sulcus and the corpus callosum. The inferior surface of the frontal lobe rests on the orbital plate of the frontal bone. The natural boundaries of the parietal lobe on the lateral surface are the central and lateral sulci. The other boundaries consist of two lines. The first of these is drawn between the parieto-occipital sulcus and the pre-occipital notch, and the second line runs from the middle of the one just established to the lateral sulcus. On the medial surface, the parietal lobe is bounded by the frontal lobe, corpus callosum, calcarine sulcus, and parieto-occipital sulcus. The temporal lobe is outlined on the lateral surface by the lateral sulcus and the lines previously noted. The inferior surface of the temporal lobe extends to the temporal pole from a line drawn between the anterior end of the calcarine sulcus and the pre-occipital notch. Most of the occipital lobe appears on the medial surface of the hemisphere, where it is separated from the temporal lobe as already described, and from the parietal lobe by the parieto-occipital sulcus. On the lateral surface, the occipital lobe consists of the small area posterior to the line that joins the parieto-occipital sulcus and the pre-occipital notch.
Hi, in this video I'm going to talk about the functional cortical anatomy of the medial aspect of a hemisphere of the brain. So I'll just draw the brain up quickly. And on this surface of the brain, there are many different areas and quite a bit of detail. And around the periphery of this aspect, we'll see many features that are wrapped from the lateral side of the brain onto the medial side of the brain. But first I'll start off by labeling the third ventricle here in the center. And here is a large white matter tract that connects the two hemispheres of the brain known as the corpus callosum. Now above the third ventricle is the fornix, which is a smaller white matter tract. And then between that and the corpus callosum is the septum pellucidum, and that lies between the two lateral ventricles. Now, up here we have the primary somatosensory cortex. So that's Brodmann areas 2, 1, and 3. And we saw this on the lateral aspect of the brain. And so here it is wrapping over onto the medial aspect. Here we have Brodmann area 5, and that's the association somatosensory cortex. Now here is the primary motor cortex, and this is an extension of Brodmann 4, which also wraps around from the lateral to medial aspects of the hemisphere. Here is Brodmann area 6. This is the premotor cortex. And then Brodmann area 8, which is the frontal eye fields. And these are important for eye movement. Brodmann area 9 is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is important in motor planning. Brodmann area 10 lies anteriorly, and this is the anterior prefrontal cortex, which is thought to be a center of higher cognition. Inferiorly, we have the orbitofrontal area. This is Brodmann area 11. And this is thought to be involved in planning and decision making. Now back at the top, we have Brodmann area 7, which is the somatosensory association center. Now down the back, we meet three very familiar Brodmann areas, 17, 18, and 19. And these are the same as their lateral counterparts. So 17 is the primary visual cortex, also known as V1. Then we have V2 and V3 for 18 and 19 respectively. Down here just below the uncus is the piriform cortex. And this plays a role in olfaction, or the sense of smell. And behind that is the parahippocampal gyrus. And that's believed to be involved in memory. Now, up here is the three areas in the cingulate cortex, area 24, 33, and 32, and these make up the anterior cingulate cortex, which is an area believed to be involved in empathy and emotion. Now, this isn't an exhaustive list of the Brodmann areas and the functions of this part of the cortex, but it's a comprehensive overview of the functional cortical anatomy of the surface of the brain. For more free